In 1650, the most powerful general in Europe, Oliver Cromwell, was trapped. His veteran army, the legendary New Model Army, was cornered in a muddy pit, sick, starving, and surrounded by a Scottish force twice its size. The general who had brought Cromwell to his knees was David Leslie, a defensive master whose genius had won the entire campaign without firing a shot. Cromwell was days from surrender. Until one fatal night, Leslie's own political allies handed Cromwell the entire war in a single, suicidal mistake. This is the story of the battle that changed Britain forever. The war that erupted across the North Sea was not just another engagement in the chaotic British civil wars. It was a profound clash of two diametrically opposed visions of God, king, and nation. The English Parliament, fresh from the turmoil of revolution, was led by the iron will of General Cromwell. Cromwell had not just defeated the old order, he had presided over the trial and execution of King Charles I, an act that sent shockwaves across the monarchies of Europe. He had purged his own ranks of moderate voices, consolidating control to ensure the survival of the fragile republic. In doing so, he forged the New Model Army, NMA, into the most terrifyingly effective military machine in Europe. This was not merely a band of fighting men bought with gold, it was an army of deeply disciplined, religiously fervent men who saw themselves as instruments of divine justice. They were known to spend as much time in prayer and reading scripture as they did in rigid military drill. They truly believed their overwhelming military victories were proof of divine favor and that God had personally chosen them to establish a righteous, uncompromised English republic. Their military philosophy, honed in the brutal years of civil war, was simple and brutally effective. They would employ the strategic advantage of mobility, organization, and heavy cavalry to strike hard, fast, and decisively, always seeking the single, swift knockout blow in every engagement. Scotland, however, stood diametrically opposed. Horrified by the regicide, the nation, dominated by the strict Presbyterian Covenanters, swiftly declared the late king's exiled son, Charles II, their own sovereign, welcoming him to Edinburgh with promises of military aid. For Cromwell, this declaration represented an existential threat of the highest order. To allow a cohesive, unified royalist power base to consolidate just across the border, backed by a formidable army and a legitimate claim to the throne, was to invite a slow, agonizing death for the nascent English Republic. He had to invade, and he had to crush the threat quickly, bringing the full weight of his authority and military might to bear before the royalist cause could rally continental support. But the Scottish nation did not rest its fate solely on the young king's dubious charm or popular support. Their entire defense was placed in the seasoned, capable hands of David Leslie. Leslie was a man whose military wisdom was vast and deeply proven. A veteran of the brutal 30 Years' War in continental Europe, he had served under the great Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus, learning firsthand that battles are often won not by glory on the field, but through relentless economic pressure, logistical superiority, and superior positional defense. He was a master of terrain, engineering, and logistics. Leslie's strategy was not one of glorious assault, but a cautious, calculated war of attrition, designed to bleed the invader dry through disease, starvation, and morale collapse without ever committing his precious army to the one-on-one, pitched battle that Cromwell and his superior cavalry craved. This entire campaign would thus become a grueling, months-long strategic duel between two masters of war, both at the peak of their genius. Cromwell, the aggressive, lightning-quick hammer seeking the decisive knockout blow, and Leslie, the patient, immovable shield, determined to simply wait out the storm until the English army shattered itself against the Scottish defences and the Scottish climate. The two armies were about to begin a terrifying months-long game of cat and mouse, where one general sought to end the war in a single day, and the other sought to prolong it until the enemy simply faded away entirely. Cromwell's invasion of Scotland, which commenced in late July of 1650, was anticipated to be a lightning strike, a swift, punishing blow to the king's new allies. Instead, the English general immediately found himself facing a phantom war, a campaign played out on a field designed meticulously for his defeat. Leslie's genius was not in fighting, but in refusing to fight. Cromwell's army, some 16,000 veteran troops, crossed the border and immediately began to sense the trap. David Leslie had implemented a comprehensive scorched earth policy, a brutal but supremely effective military measure. Every village was cleared of provisions and fodder, livestock was driven away, mills were dismantled, and any local inhabitants who could provide intelligence were swiftly evacuated or silenced. The land was not just empty, it was aggressively hostile. The new model army, despite its incredible discipline and professionalism, could find no forage for its thousands of horses and no support from the local populace. They were forced to rely entirely on cumbersome, slow seaborne supplies, a lifeline of ships and wagons carrying everything from biscuit and beer to gunpowder that trailed them up the North Sea coast. This was a vulnerable, mile-long logistical umbilical cord, constantly threatened by weather and Scottish raiding parties. This dependency created an immediate, crippling strategic dilemma for the English general. He could not advance far from the coast without abandoning his supply chain, and he could not possibly subsist for long in any one place with the hostile Scottish terrain and populace surrounding him. Leslie, meanwhile, had deployed his approximately 22,000 men with masterful efficiency, not for battle, but for defence. He positioned his main army and reserves around the capital of Edinburgh, utilizing the natural strongpoints of the landscape with the eye of a true military engineer. He expertly fortified the ancient town, building formidable earthworks, and skillfully lined the formidable slopes of Calton Hill and Salisbury Crags. He drew up defensive lines, a complex system of trenches, redoubts, and fortified barriers that were virtually impenetrable, blocking every single road and pass into the city. His forward lines stretched from the fortified coastal positions on the Firth of Forth all the way to the entrenched suburbs of Edinburgh, presenting a continuous, defiant, and immensely difficult barrier for the English to cross. From his secure, elevated positions on the heights overlooking the city, Leslie could watch every single movement Cromwell made, while Cromwell could only stare up at a towering, immovable fortress. The English general, desperate to force a quick, decisive battle, tried every feint and maneuver in his formidable playbook. He probed the lines, he marched his forces to the west, then to the south, always looking for a weakness, a gap, a chance to force the pitched battle he needed to bring his superior cavalry into play. Leslie did not budge. He ordered his men under strict discipline not to engage, not to take the bait, and not to fire unless fired upon. He was patient. He was waiting for the damp Scottish weather and the inevitable epidemic of sickness to do his work for him. As the days turned into weeks throughout the humid, cold, and damp month of August, the genius of Leslie's attrition strategy became brutally clear. Cromwell was being choked out. The new model army, unable to find fresh water or adequate food, and facing the constant exposure of camp life, began to suffer terribly. The ranks, hardened by years of civil war, were now being decimated not by Scottish steel, but by dysentery and exposure. These non-combat losses soon surpassed any casualties they had taken in all their previous campaigns. The psychological effect was profound. Cromwell's letters from this period reveal a man wrestling with deep spiritual doubt, wondering if God had finally withdrawn his divine favor from the Republic and its army. His men, the saints of the new model army, were sickening and dying, unable to employ the superior cavalry and firepower that had won them every battle south of the border. They were trapped in a strategic deadlock, their primary strength utterly negated by one man's patient refusal to fight. Cromwell's army was slowly fading away, with no end in sight. The frustration on the English side was immense. They were prepared to fight and win, but they were not prepared to simply wait and rot. This was the moment where the power of passive defense was proving its absolute worth against even the most aggressive military force. The man who had conquered a republic was now days from being destroyed, not by a sword, but by a fever, and there seemed to be no path out of the Scottish trap. For weeks, Cromwell pressed, Leslie refused, and the new model army bled men to illness, not swords. By late August, the game was over. Cromwell had definitively lost the war of maneuver and attrition. His army, having lost thousands of men to disease and unable to secure local resources, was simply too weak and too sick to sustain the siege lines around Edinburgh. The only realistic course of action was a full withdrawal. Cromwell had to retreat toward the sea at Dunbar to secure his supply line, reorganize, and potentially evacuate the entire expedition back to England. This move was not a rout, but a professional necessity, a brilliant recognition of defeat in the attritional campaign. Yet, to the inexperienced, politically motivated eyes of the Committee of Estates, the powerful religious body overseeing the Scottish army, retreat looked like God delivering the enemy into their hands. If you find these epic historical battles as compelling as we do, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more untold stories of military genius to light. This political oversight proved utterly fatal to the Scottish cause. As Cromwell executed his withdrawal, Leslie began the final, brilliant phase of his strategic plan, a masterstroke designed to turn the English retreat into a complete, inescapable trap. Leslie led his forces on a swift flanking march, moving parallel to the English route along the coast. He expertly utilized the Lammermuir Hills, a formidable series of steep, rugged slopes and gullies, to position his army perfectly on the high ground. The geography of this coastal strip is crucial. The hills descend sharply and abruptly to a narrow coastal plain, which is then dissected by deep, sudden ravines and streams. Leslie successfully moved his entire army onto the heights above the town of Dunbar, expertly boxing the new model army onto a small coastal strip of flat land only about 1.5 miles wide, a killing field. To the north was the unforgiving North Sea. To the south were the steep, impassable hills where Leslie's entire army waited, and to the west was the Dunbar, a sudden, deep gorge that was a nearly impassable natural barrier. Cromwell was caught and surrounded. He was, as he himself wrote, acknowledging the hopelessness of the situation, upon a hard shive, and in a worse condition than we were in before, trapped between the hills and the sea. With the English army cornered and desperate, David Leslie had, for all intents and purposes, won the campaign. He held the tactical high ground, his army was better supplied and fresher than the sickened English, and his positions were virtually unassailable. He needed only to maintain the blockade and allow the new model army to starve, sicken, or surrender. This was the pinnacle of his defensive genius. But this strategic victory was immediately undermined by a wave of political zealotry. The Scottish Committee of Estates and the Covenanter ministers in camp, driven by a rigid and fanatical desire to deliver a final, dramatic humiliation, grew immensely impatient. They were a powerful, pious, and militarily naive group who believed that God demanded a crushing, immediate blow against the English heretics and regicides. They viewed Leslie's cautious, strategic defense as a sign of cowardice or a profound lack of faith in divine providence. They insisted that the Lord had personally delivered Cromwell into their hands for a final, glorious slaughter. Despite Leslie's furious and detailed protests, for he knew the absolute, unassailable advantage of his current position on the heights, the committee overruled the general's military command. They ordered him to abandon the secure, high ground and move the bulk of his army down the slopes and onto the narrow coastal plain, in preparation for a decisive battle the following day. This single act of political arrogance and religious overreach instantly negated 2 months of masterful military strategy. Leslie was forced to execute a maneuver he knew would doom his army. Leslie protested, knowing their hubris was about to cost them the nation, but the general was overruled. His greatest victory was now sealed as his greatest mistake. Rain lashed the North Sea coast throughout the night of September 2nd, turning the steep slopes of the Lammermuir Hills into slick, impassable mud. Down in the valley, the English army was huddled in the freezing dark, awaiting what seemed like certain surrender or destruction. Cromwell, wrestling with his conscience, even considered breaking the terms of his retreat to evacuate his remaining men by sea, an act of desperation. But on the heights above, Leslie's army was moving, and a few keen-eyed officers in Cromwell's camp saw the tactical blunder unfold in the midnight mist. Leslie, obeying the suicidal demands of the committee, began the catastrophic process of shifting his army in the dark. Moving 22,000 men, along with their supply train, horses and cannons across difficult, rain-slicked terrain at night is an engineering nightmare that few modern generals would attempt. In doing so, he made a crucial and unavoidable error on the tight, difficult ground. He moved the mass of his army, particularly his stronger horse and infantry, from the open, secure heights onto the narrow, low ground. This night maneuver had two immediate and devastating consequences. First, it cramped his formations severely, bunching his troops into thick, static blocks near the Dunbar gorge, making them vulnerable targets. Second, and most critically, by shifting his right wing forward and down the slope, he fatally stretched his line and effectively exposed his right flank to the English positions. The flank was left hanging, unsupported, and vulnerable to a concentrated attack. In the pre-dawn confusion and poor light, the Scottish army was transitioning from a secure defensive position to a vulnerable offensive one, a maneuver that demands precision and order. Two things the Scots were about to run out of entirely. As the night wore on, key English officers, likely including Cromwell's trusted lieutenant, General John Lambert, scouted the Scottish movements and rushed back with the crucial intelligence. They reported the impossible. The Scottish army was moving down from the hills, and a large, vital portion of their line was now completely exposed on the low ground. Cromwell's initial despair gave way to a shocking, powerful burst of strategic clarity. He realized this was not a mistake by Leslie the general, but a forced error by Leslie the political pawn. Leslie had fatally compromised his flank, and a general of Cromwell's caliber knew that an opportunity of this magnitude only knocks once in a lifetime. The English general made the decision of a lifetime. He would not wait for surrender, he would not wait for the sun, and he would not attack the main Scottish body. The simple, brilliant plan was hatched in the dark. He would concentrate the vast majority of his superior cavalry and infantry against that exposed right wing, driving a massive hammer blow straight into the flank before the rest of the Scottish line, tangled in the muddy terrain, could react or deploy. Cromwell realized his defeat had been cancelled out by the crippling pressure of their own politics, and he knew exactly where and when he would strike. The order went out through the freezing camp: be ready to move at 4 o'clock in the morning. They would trust in their discipline, their fervour, and the blinding speed of a concentrated dawn assault. At 4 o'clock in the morning, as the first grey light crept across the North Sea, the English right wing moved. It was a calculated risk, a desperate final throw of the dice by a trapped general. But when the first volley erupted in the pre-dawn gloom, it was not the orderly charge Leslie expected. It was a devastating, overwhelming storm of fire and steel aimed at his most vulnerable point. Cromwell's troops, invigorated by the sudden shift from despair to purpose, launched their attack with stunning discipline and speed. As the new model army cavalry and infantry hit the compacted Scottish right flank, the formations already cramped and confused by the night maneuver immediately broke. This was the precise moment where the superior training, drill, and discipline of the new model army proved decisive. The English shouted their now famous battle cry, "Let God arise, and let his enemies be scattered." The Scottish cavalry, which was supposed to anchor the flank and defend the position, was completely overwhelmed and thrown back directly onto their own stationary infantry, creating a sudden, horrifying chain reaction of ruin that tore through the dense, packed Scottish formations. The Scottish army was utterly unable to bring its main strength to bear. The cramped terrain of the coastal plain prevented the rest of the army from manoeuvring to support the disintegrating flank, and the Dunbar gorge prevented Leslie from rapidly shifting forces across his front. The entire Scottish army was reduced to watching its right flank be systematically destroyed, unable to intervene. Leslie attempted a desperate counterattack with his limited reserves, but the momentum was now entirely and irreversibly with the English. As the sun finally crested the horizon, illuminating the field, Cromwell saw the victory confirmed and ordered a full advance of his entire line, realizing the opportunity was absolute. The sheer speed and surprise of the assault meant the Scottish resistance collapsed entirely. What followed was a complete rout. The English cavalry pursued the fleeing Scots relentlessly, turning a broken army into a scattered mob in the muddy ravines and gullies. By 9 o'clock that morning, the battle was definitively over. The statistics of the victory were simply staggering. Cromwell's new model army lost only around 20 men killed. The Scottish army, which had held the strategic advantage hours earlier, suffered 3,000 killed and fully 10,000 captured, in addition to the loss of all their supplies, cannons and standards. It was an absolute military upset of incredible proportions, a moment where the tactical genius of a single general seized a political blunder to rewrite the course of the war. The defeat at Dunbar was a fatal humiliation for the Scottish Covenanters. It permanently broke the power of the Committee of Estates, shattered the backbone of the Scottish army, and allowed Cromwell to swiftly secure Edinburgh, forcing Charles II to flee north in search of new allies. The road to the eventual conquest and subjugation of Scotland was irrevocably opened, and Cromwell, the general who had been trapped and facing certain defeat just hours earlier, was now the undisputed master of the three kingdoms. He would go on to consolidate his power and ultimately become the Lord Protector, fundamentally reshaping the political landscape of Britain for a generation. If you enjoyed this detailed look into the turning point of the Cromwellian Wars, please share this story with another history enthusiast, and let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next. The Siege of Dunbar is a powerful story of how the discipline of an elite army and the timely recognition of an enemy's political weakness can overcome impossible odds. It proves that history isn't always decided by the size of the force, but sometimes by the smallest, most crucial tactical maneuver and the crippling pressure of political hubris. If you want to see more stories about the incredible battles that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to our channel and engage with us in the comments.